Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today's deep dive tackles the ultimate clash between belief in God and the skeptical, often atheistic search for natural explanations. We're exploring the concept of the adversary, how humanity has historically defined evil, from cosmic rebels in the biblical throne room to terrifying rituals in ancient valleys to levitating exorcisms and winged monsters in New Jersey. Is evil a literal spiritual force at war with God? Or is it a psychological and sociological construct used by religious clerics to explain chaos and keep people in line?
Man, that tension between the divine and the secular is, it's probably the single most influential debate in human history.
Oh, without a doubt. And if you like my channel, please subscribe and hit the like button, because today's mission is huge. We are pulling from some amazing sources, including transcripts from a Bible Project series that analyzes spiritual beings, right alongside historical breakdowns from the History Channel's The Unexplained.
Yeah, and it's so important to mention that we're unpacking these sources completely impartially today.
Exactly. Whether you approach this from a deeply religious perspective or, a strictly atheistic one, our goal is to understand how these texts and historical accounts frame the concept of spiritual evil, and more importantly, how that concept actively impacts human behavior. Okay,
Yeah.
let's unpack that.
Right, so to really grasp how human beings perceive evil manifesting on Earth, we sort of have to start at the cosmic origin story these ancient texts give us.
Going right to the root.
Yeah, going all the way back to the opening pages of Genesis, because there's this very specific theological architecture being built there. You have Supreme Creator organizing a beautiful, functioning reality out of, just pure darkness and disorder.
But then almost immediately, that pristine architecture gets challenged. Just a couple of chapters later, a creature shows up who is in a state of absolute calculated rebellion against the Creator's design.
Right, the famous snake in the garden.
Yeah, but popular culture has totally conditioned us to picture like a literal slithering reptile in an apple tree. And the linguistic analysis in our material paints a vastly different picture.
It really does. The Hebrew text provides this brilliant clue that just blows that Sunday school image completely out of the water.
Because the word isn't really snake, is it?
No, it's not. The word used in the ancient text is seraphim. And while that can be translated as snake, it more accurately translates to burning one.
Wow. Burning one.
Yeah. And it's the exact same word used later by the prophet Isaiah to describe those terrifying, fiery spiritual beings that surround and praise God in the heavenly throne room.
That completely shifts the narrative weight of the story. I mean, we aren't dealing with a talking garden snake. This creature is essentially, well, my favorite analogy is that it's like a disgruntled former staff member of God's heavenly throne room.
That is a brilliant way to put it.
Right. It's this highly placed spiritual entity who, according to later biblical commentary, just abhorred the idea of living under authority. It wanted to be the boss.
Yeah.
I mean, it wanted to be God. And then it offers that exact same temptation to the first humans. This intoxicating idea that they can define good and evil on their own terms, completely apart from the Creator.
And on top of that, the terminology we use today is entirely misunderstood. Like, people throw around the word Satan as if it were a first name.
Like a cosmic villain's birth certificate or something.
Right, exactly. But it's actually a title. In the original Hebrew, it carries the definite article, the Satan.
Which translates literally to the adversary. Right?
Yes. And later, when the texts were translated into Greek, the term became the devil, which actually means the slanderer.
Okay, so that paints a terrifying cosmic picture for a believer. But if you look at it through the lens of secular history, a completely different mechanism emerges.
Oh, absolutely. The sociological angle.
Right. From an atheistic perspective, isn't this entire narrative just a remarkably efficient mechanism of control? For centuries, the fear of eternal damnation, the looming threat of this ultimate adversary, it was a highly effective tool used to keep the masses terrified and totally submissive to the clerics in charge.
It's a very compelling argument.
It makes me wonder if humanity just needed a singular scapegoat for our own bad behavior. Like, is it just easier to say the devil made me do it than to actually take responsibility for our own greed and violence?
What's fascinating here is that this psychological reflex isn't isolated to Judeo-Christian history. We see an incredible cross-cultural synthesis across the globe.
Really? Like, where else?
Well, in Buddhist tradition, you find Mara, who is a demonic king, often depicted as this terrifying, shape-shifting mix of human and animal forms who tries to derail enlightenment.
Oh, wow.
And in Islam, you have the figure of Iblis. It seems that humanity, regardless of geographic isolation or specific religious doctrine, harbors this universal, profound need to embody the concept of anti-order and evil into a singular, recognizable face.
Because we cannot tolerate faceless chaos.
Precisely.
It seems to me that whether it's a burning seraphim or a shape-shifting demon king, our brains just demand a culprit. But the narrative doesn't stay in the heavenly throne room, does it?
No, it doesn't.
The texts show us how this cosmic rebellion quickly fractures. It descends from a singular mastermind right down into human society. We transition from the Satan to a multitude of lesser spiritual rebels.
And we see how they begin infecting human power structures. The biblical timeline moves forward to an incredibly bizarre and honestly often misunderstood passage in Genesis 6.
Oh, right. The sons of God.
Yeah, it introduces these beings called the sons of God. The narrative describes them as other members of the heavenly host who decided to join the rebellion.
And they came down to earth, right?
Right. The text claims they descended to earth, intermingled with human women, and produced this incredibly violent race of giant warriors known as the Nephilim.
Now, to a modern, scientifically minded reader, that sounds like pure mythological fantasy.
Of course it does.
But looking at the historical context reveals why this was written. The surrounding ancient empires at the time, the rivals to the early Israelites, they actively worshipped their own giant warrior kings.
Yeah, they built massive cults around them.
Exactly. Cults around rulers they claimed were literal demigods, part human and part divine.
So the biblical authors were deploying this devastating piece of political and theological subversion. They were looking at these revered, heavily militarized rulers of rival nations and deliberately reframing their entire mythology.
Telling their readers, hey, these kings aren't divine heroes.
Right. They were saying these guys are the corrupted offspring of spiritual rebels. They are human pawns, completely captive to spiritual evil, spreading violence in a world that was designed for peace.
And that subversive critique just accelerates. Moses, in the book of Deuteronomy, looks back at these corrupt empires and claims that God actually handed those nations over to worship the rebel host of heaven.
And Moses is the first figure in the text to explicitly label these entities as demons, right?
Yes, exactly. He strips away the divine mystique of rival gods and categorizes them as parasitic spiritual forces driving the human obsession with money, sex, and military conquest.
And that political critique ultimately manifests in one of the absolute darkest physical realities of the ancient world.
You're talking about the valley outside Jerusalem.
Yeah. Just outside the walls lies a deep, rocky ravine called the Valley of Hinnom. It was later known as Gehenna, which eventually became the foundational Hebrew concept and word for hell.
Here's where it gets really interesting and incredibly harrowing, to be honest.
Right?
The historical records from that era reveal that in this very valley, desperate citizens constructed massive fire pits.
Yeah.
And they would gather there to sacrifice their own children, specifically their firstborn sons, to these satanic demons.
It's just horrific.
It is. But the motive wasn't random sadism.
Mm-hmm.
They committed this atrocity simply to ensure that the seasonal rains would come and their crops would grow.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the atheistic and sociological analysis shines through with absolute clarity.
How so?
Well, we have to ask, did these ancient people actually interact with literal demons demanding the blood of their children? Or does the Valley of Hinnom demonstrate how a profound ignorance of meteorology drove early humans to invent dark gods?
Right. I mean, think about your own life for a second. When you feel entirely out of control, whether it's a collapsing economy or a health crisis, or in their case, a devastating drought, how desperate do you get to regain a sense of agency?
Extremely desperate.
Yeah. If you don't understand the atmospheric science behind a weather front, a failed harvest feels like a targeted curse from a very angry, invisible entity.
They needed a manager to bargain with, someone who could, pull the levers of the sky, even if the requested price was horrific.
And the biblical authors recognized this desperation.
They did, and they actively critiqued the corrupt power structures that exploited it. Take the Empire of Babylon, for example.
Oh, Babylon's a great example.
Right. Our analysis notes that Babylon was founded by a legendary king named Nimrod, and his very name sounds virtually identical to the Hebrew word for rebel.
That's not a coincidence.
Not at all. The biblical text isn't just telling a spooky story. It is actively labeling the greed, the aggressive militarism, and the horrific child sacrifice rituals of these ancient empires as literal institutionalized demonic activity.
Okay, so we can clearly see how the concept of the adversary plays out on a macro societal level, influencing entire ancient economies and empires.
Right.
But demonic possession, by definition, requires a human host.
How does this battle between religious belief and scientific skepticism hold up when that perceived spiritual chaos infects an individual? Let's move to the intimately personal front lines of the unexplainable exorcism.
Oh man, it is the ultimate collision of ancient theology and modern medicine.
It really is.
Our material highlights this viral incident from May of 2013, where Pope Francis was captured on video laying hands on a man in St. Peter's Square who was believed to be possessed.
I remember that video.
Yeah, that single moment thrust a practice as old as recorded history, spanning the ancient Near East, India, and China, right onto the screens of the modern digital age. And it's fascinating to look at how modern Catholic exorcists actually operate in the 21st century, because they rely heavily on what the Church calls sacramentals, objects like holy water, rosary beads, and crucifixes.
But the literature emphasizes a crucial distinction there.
Exactly. They do not view these items as magical talismans. And exorcism isn't a spell. The Church views these objects as physical, symbolic prayers that express the spiritual authority of the institution itself.
However, the methodology isn't what causes the primary friction between skepticism and belief. It's the physical claims documented during these rituals.
The anomalies.
Right. We are talking about testimonies of physical anomalies that aggressively defy the known laws of physics.
I have to put my foot down here.
Mm-hmm.
As someone who profoundly respects the scientific method, how are we supposed to process claims of a 110-pound woman effortlessly throwing 3 large men across a room?
It sounds impossible.
Or multiple eyewitnesses swearing they saw victims physically levitating in midair? Where is the line between a genuine physiological adrenaline spike and a complete violation of the laws of gravity?
That is the exact blurry line our texts highlight. And it's a tension the exorcists themselves openly acknowledge.
They do.
Yeah, they aren't flat earth theorists. They understand and accept the laws of normal science and gravity. Their theological argument, however, relies on the premise that dark forces are interdimensional.
Meaning they operate outside our physical reality.
Exactly. And therefore, they possess the ability to temporarily override or violate the natural laws of our universe when they intersect with it.
But wait, if we look deeper into their actual process, an incredible psychological compromise emerges.
Oh, the dual track system.
Yes,
Yeah.
you would expect an exorcist to be entirely focused on the supernatural, ignoring modern medicine. Yet they openly admit that the individuals they treat are often highly educated, psychologically balanced professionals.
Military personnel, lawyers, doctors.
Right, and they focus heavily on past trauma. Aren't they essentially just conducting intensive psychotherapy dressed up with ancient Latin and a crucifix? Where is the line between treating severe PTSD and fighting a demon?
Well, the practitioners argue that the two are inextricably linked. The texts describe emotional trauma almost like an open spiritual wound.
So it attracts them.
Yeah, just as physical bacteria will flock to an untreated cut on your arm, these malevolent entities supposedly flock to untreated psychological pain, deep-seated anger, unforgiveness, or severe abuse.
So modern exorcists explicitly state that they operate on this dual-track system.
They do. They work to facilitate psychological healing right alongside the spiritual rites. The theory is that if you heal the inner psychological wound, you remove the emotional fuel that the demonic entity is feeding on.
It seems like whether it's erratic human behavior or ancient geopolitical warfare, the mechanism is exactly the same. Our brains simply cannot tolerate a lack of causality.
We have to know why things happen.
Exactly. If modern science or psychology cannot entirely fill the gap of understanding, we immediately default to the supernatural. But what happens when that perceived chaos isn't infecting a person or an empire, but is literally written into the physical landscape itself?
All right.
Let's talk about how we label the geographic unknown.
When the environment breaks the rules of our expected reality, the psychological reflex is identical. We slap the word devil on it.
A perfect geographical example is Devil's Tower in Wyoming.
Visually, it is completely jarring.
It really is. Imagine a colossal 900-foot grayish-green rock jutting straight up into the sky out of completely flat, endless sedimentary plains.
With absolutely no surrounding volcanic activity to explain its presence.
None. It is so utterly baffling to the eye that in 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt declared America's very first national monument.
But long before Roosevelt signed that declaration, indigenous Native American tribes revered the formation as a highly sacred space.
They didn't see it as evil at all.
No, they didn't view it as evil. They saw it as a natural altar for divine inspiration, a conduit to communicate with the broader universe.
And then, true to form, modern culture projects its own mysteries onto it. Steven Spielberg famously used Devil's Tower as the massive UFO landing site in his 1977 film Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Which caused tourism to absolutely skyrocket, of course.
Naturally, we are presented with a massive, unexplainable geological anomaly, and our cultural instinct is instantly to associate it with ancient spirits, extraterrestrials, or demonic architecture.
And we apply that exact same instinct when we move from the mysteries of geology to the terrifying shadows of biology, or perhaps more accurately, cryptozoology.
You're talking about the Jersey Devil.
Yes. The legend of the Jersey Devil perfectly encapsulates this societal phenomenon.
The Pine Barrens of New Jersey is this massive 1 million acre stretch of incredibly dense, dark woodland. And the historical legend in our material dates back to 1735.
The story of Mother Leeds.
Right. It claims a woman named Mother Leeds was giving birth to her 13th child. And out of pure exhaustion and frustration, she supposedly cursed the infant.
And then the baby violently transformed into a grotesque beast sporting a horse's head, massive bat wings, and bird legs.
Now, on the surface, it reads like a classic, terrifying campfire story designed to keep children out of the woods. What makes it genuinely historically significant, however, is how thoroughly this narrative infected, documented public consciousness. We have written reports from highly credible historical figures who swore they encountered it.
Like Commodore Stephen Decatur.
Yes, a highly distinguished naval war hero. He allegedly saw this creature flying overhead while testing artillery and fired a literal cannonball directly through its wing.
So what does this all mean?
So what does this all mean? I mean, we have an esteemed military commander shooting artillery at a flying horsebat. And the cultural panic didn't stop in the 18th century.
Not at all.
In 1909, the region experienced an absolute mass hysteria. Schools and businesses were entirely shut down. Citizens were barricaded in their homes.
A local trolley car in Haddon Heights was reportedly dive-bombed by the creature.
And the panic reached such a fever pitch that the Philadelphia Zoo actually offered a $10,000 reward for its capture.
This raises an important question. Are these anomalies actually supernatural, or do they exist to keep mankind humble?
That's a great way to frame it.
Right. Why did society snap in 1909? You have to consider the role of early 20th century media sensationalism combined with deep local anxieties and the primal evolutionary fear of the dark woods.
Because long before Mother Leeds allegedly cursed her child, the Native American Lenape tribes already referred to the Pine Barrens as the place of the dragon.
Exactly. The terror of that dense, lightless forest predates European settlement.
It is our way of taking back control of the unknown. If the woods are terrifying and unpredictable, giving the terror a specific name, a monster we can theoretically hunt or shoot a cannon at, gives us an illusion of agency.
The skeptical view synthesized from our analysis is deeply profound here. We, as modern citizens, love to navigate the world with the supreme arrogance that we entirely understand our planet.
We have smartphones, global satellites, AI.
Yeah. Yet the reality remains that we still cannot perfectly predict a catastrophic earthquake. We still debate the exact atmospheric mechanics of how lightning travels.
It's humbling.
It really is. When we are faced with a geographic conundrum that defies geology, or when we hear strange, blood-curdling wildlife sounds in a pitch-black forest, our deeply ingrained human instinct is to immediately ascribe a mystical, demonic, or supernatural attribute to it.
Which brings this massive, sprawling debate right back to you, the listener. Whether you lean heavily toward the atheistic, skeptical view that Satan and demons are merely ancient, pre-scientific attempts to explain severe psychological trauma, horrific natural disasters, and the boundless depths of human greed.
Or you hold the religious view.
Right. Or you hold the religious view that there is a literal cosmic adversary actively working to drag creation back into chaos. The impact on human history is identical.
Absolutely identical.
A fear of the dark and our desperate human desire to fight back against it has shaped absolutely everything. It shaped the rise and fall of ancient political empires. It fueled the desperate, fiery rituals in the Valley of Hinnom. And it continues to shape the psychological frameworks we use to process trauma today.
I think there is one final incredible connection to linger on here. one that bridges the ancient theological texts with modern scientific reality.
What's that?
In the sources, the title "the Satan" literally translates to the adversary. The texts define this entity as being anti-everything, a force constantly, relentlessly working to drag structured order back into a state of darkness and total disorder.
The literal unraveling of creation.
Exactly. Now, consider the alternative lens. If we strip away the religious context, the robes, and the ancient Hebrew, and we look at the universe purely through the lens of modern physics.
Okay, I'm following you.
That definition, the inevitable, inescapable degradation of matter and energy from a state of complex order into a state of chaotic disorder, is the exact scientific definition of entropy.
That is staggering, the fundamental law of thermodynamics.
It leaves us with a truly provocative question. Is it possible that ancient humans in their scrolls and their terrors weren't necessarily describing a literal horned monster orchestrating a cosmic war?
But instead,
Were they in fact simply giving a terrifying, recognizable face to the inescapable laws of thermodynamics? The ultimate adversary isn't just a rebel in a heavenly throne room. It is the very fabric of a universe that is constantly, silently fighting to pull our ordered reality back into the dark.
and suddenly that murky diagnostic landscape we started with feels even deeper. Thank you for joining us as we explored the roots of the adversary, the science of the unexplainable, and the incredible ways humanity fights the dark. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.